Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're really cutting through the complexity to get to the heart of something crucial. We're talking about the legal architecture, the very foundation that governs how professional engineers and geoscientists practice here in Canada. If you're aiming to become one, maybe studying right now, this stuff is absolutely fundamental. It's the why behind all the rules and regulations you'll live by in your career. Like, what single legal framework actually gives you the authority, the right to put your stamp on a drawing or sign off on a geological report? So we're jumping right into this mandatory structure. It's all about public protection, ultimately. Our mission today, to really unpack two huge concepts, licensing and self-regulation. We want to go beyond just definitions. We're digging into how they work, why they matter legally, and the responsibilities that come with professional accountability.
That's right. This is the absolute legal bedrock for practice. You can't separate the profession from this framework. The whole system really stands on these two pillars, and they aren't just tradition. They're set up by actual laws. And they're designed very carefully to ensure professionals are competent, technically sound, and maybe even more critically, that they stick to rigorous ethical standards. It all comes back to protecting the public.
Exactly. And hey, before we dive into the legal nitty-gritty, a quick word. If you are prepping for the National Professional Practice Examination, the NPPE, and you're looking for this kind of focused, essential knowledge that takes complex regulations and makes them, well, understandable and useful for the exam, then you really should subscribe right now. We're building out the insights you need to truly tackle the NPPE with confidence. Don't miss out. Okay, so let's get into this legal foundation. It's clear the authority comes from legislation, specific acts passed by provinces and territories, not the federal government, which might seem a bit counterintuitive for national professions, right? Why is it set up this way? Why do provinces handle the regulation, not Ottawa?
Yeah, that's a common question. It really boils down to the Canadian Constitution. The Constitution assigns the power to regulate professions, set up licenses, and manage all those related details pretty squarely to the provinces. It usually falls under provincial powers like property and civil rights, or matters that are considered, local or private in nature. So what that means in practice is every single province, every territory has to have its own regulatory body, its own association. And that body gets its power directly from its own specific provincial or territorial act. You just can't have one single federal license for engineers or geoscientists in Canada.
Okay, constitutionally mandated. But that sounds like it could create inefficiencies, couldn't it? I mean, if the technical standards are pretty much the same across the country, why wouldn't everyone just agree on one national body? Wouldn't that be simpler for moving around for administration?
Well, you've hit on the inherent tension there. Efficiency is definitely something people talk about. But the current structure is, as I said, a constitutional thing. Plus, having separate acts does let each jurisdiction tailor things a bit to their specific local context, though the main goal, public protection, that stays consistent everywhere. And these acts, they're pretty comprehensive. They delegate the power to self-govern directly to the association.
And that delegation seems to be the absolute key. Like in Alberta, you've got the Engineering and Geoscience Professions Act, the EGP Act, giving APEGA the power to run its own show, basically.
Yeah.
And similarly, APEGS in Saskatchewan gets all its authority, its duties, straight from its own specific act.
Exactly right. Think of these acts as the legal charter for the profession in that province. They generally cover three really critical interwoven areas. First, they legally define what actually counts as practicing professional engineering or geoscience there, what work is restricted. Second, they protect those specific titles we all know, PEing, PGO, and say who can use them. Very important. And third, maybe most fundamentally, they actually establish the association and give it the power, the authority to set the standards for getting in, enforce ethical rules, investigate complaints, and discipline members when needed. Take PGNL in Newfoundland and Labrador, for instance. Their act, the Engineers and Geoscientists Act, 2008, explicitly mandates them to regulate only in the public interest. That act spells everything out, from how they grant an individual license to how they go after someone practicing illegally without one.
Okay, that flows nicely into licensing itself. The formal legal permission to practice. So it's not just like joining a club. It's a legal status granted under that provincial act. How does someone actually get this license? What are the hurdles?
Right. Individual licensing isn't trivial. You have to meet some pretty tough, multi-layered requirements. We're talking about proving your academic qualifications meet the standard, demonstrating you have the right amount and type of professional experience, usually meaning years working under a licensed supervisor. Plus, Language proficiency tests in many cases, proving good character, and this is crucial passing that ethics and law exam, the NPTE. And the main point of all this, the central function, is accountability. Once you have that PE or PGO after your name, the regulatory body can hold you, personally, accountable for your work, your decisions, your judgments. You're answerable to a formal code of ethics and specific practice standards. Geoscientists Canada puts it plainly. Geoscience is regulated. You must have a license to practice, period.
Now, this is where I find the oversight gets particularly interesting, because it's not just about individuals, is it? There's also corporate or firm licensing, sometimes called a permit to practice or a certificate of authorization for the companies themselves. Why? If the PE or PGO stamping the final drawing is already licensed and accountable, why license the company too? Isn't that kind of doubling up on the regulation?
It might seem like it at first glance, but it's actually really important. It extends that regulatory oversight into the company's operations and, frankly, its culture. When a firm holds a permit, the regulator can check that the company itself has the proper systems in place, things like quality control processes, adequate insurance, making sure they employ properly licensed people for the professional work. It helps prevent a situation where a company might pressure its licensed staff into cutting corners or making unethical calls because the company structure itself isn't sound. And there's an interesting detail here. In almost all provinces and territories, companies doing geoscience work need this permit. The exceptions are British Columbia and Quebec. So while the exact mechanism isn't identical everywhere, the principle of extending accountability beyond just the individual to the business entity itself is pretty widespread. It's really seen as an extra vital layer of public protection.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. The firm can't just point fingers at the individual if something goes wrong. The organization itself has responsibilities. Okay, let's shift to title protection. The public needs to know who they can trust, right? They need a clear signal. Why is it so critical that titles like PELEANG and PGO are protected by law in these acts?
Well, think about it. If anyone could just call themselves a professional engineer, the title would be meaningless. The public wouldn't know who'd actually met the standards. The whole point of the regulatory system relies on that trust. Engineers Canada is crystal clear on this. It's straight up illegal to practice engineering or use the title professional engineer or even just the word engineer in many contexts, implying licensure, unless you are properly licensed by the provincial or territorial body. So protecting the title ensures that when someone uses it, the public can be confident that person has been thoroughly vetted academically, experientially, ethically. It guarantees reliance.
Which brings us right to the core engine driving all this: self-regulation. The idea is pretty simple on the surface. Professionals governing themselves through their association. Wow, that's a huge amount of power and trust given to a profession. Why does the government actually allow professions like engineering and geoscience to regulate themselves? And how do we ensure this isn't just, the profession looking out for itself, a closed shop situation?
That's the fundamental question, really. The justification for self-regulation always comes back to the public interest. It rests on sort of three interconnected arguments. First is specialized expertise. The thinking is that fellow professionals, peers, are simply best positioned to understand the complex technical knowledge and professional judgment needed. They're better equipped to set relevant standards, assess qualifications, and judge competency or ethical breaches compared to, say, a general government agency. Second, and directly linked, is public protection. The argument is that this system, run by experts, most effectively ensures competence and ethical behavior, thereby protecting public health, safety, welfare, the environment, property, all of it. But getting to your point about the closed shop, that's the inherent challenge, the potential conflict. Self-regulation is a delegated privilege from the government. It's not some inherent right the profession has. And yes, there's always debate about whether it might allow the profession's interests to sometimes overshadow the public's. So to counter that risk, the third key point is trust and accountability. This is built right into the legislation. The profession is granted authority, but it must operate transparently, strictly within the bounds of its act, and it's subject to government oversight and public accountability. APEGS, for instance, describes itself as a self-governing professional licensing body operating in the public interest. That last part is key.
Right, so there's supposed to be built-in checks and balances to prevent the fox guarding the henhouse problem. What are the actual mechanics? What components demonstrate this public accountability in action?
Well, it covers the whole life cycle of regulation. Starts with setting really rigorous standards for admission who gets in. And it continues with requirements for continuing professional development, or CPD. Members can't just get licensed and coast. They have to keep their skills and knowledge up to date throughout their careers. That's mandatory. Then there's the development and, critically, the enforcement of mandatory codes of ethics and detailed practice standards. These set the expected level of conduct and technical performance.
And I imagine the most visible, maybe the most critical part of accountability is that enforcement piece, dealing with things when they go wrong.
Absolutely. That's where the system prove its worth, or fails to. The ability to receive complaints, conduct thorough and fair investigations, and then impose meaningful, legally binding discipline when warranted, that's the ultimate safeguard for public trust. Look at APEG's disciplinary process again. The Act gives them significant regulatory power and discretion to make decisions that can seriously impact a member's ability to practice, even revoke their license. That enforcement power isn't just about punishing individuals, it's about reinforcing the standards for everyone and showing the public that the regulator's first duty is to them, not to protecting its members.
And we also see checks coming from outside the profession itself, right? Within the structure of the regulatory bodies. They aren't entirely run by insiders.
That's a really important point, yes. This privilege of self-regulation comes with strings attached, serious accountability back to the public and to the government. Take PG&L's board again. It includes members appointed directly by the government. These public members bring an external perspective and ensure oversight of the association's overall direction and major decisions. Plus, the associations have a duty to be proactive. They must actively police the use of titles and take action against anyone practicing without a license. APEGS explicitly states they pursue unlicensed practice and title misuse because if they don't, it erodes public confidence in the whole system. They have to enforce the boundaries.
Okay, let's talk practicalities for a minute. This provincial system, what about mobility? If I'm a licensed PGO in, say, Saskatchewan, and I want to take on a project in Nova Scotia, how does that work? Sounds like it could be a nightmare if every province has total different rules. How do professionals move around?
Yeah, that could definitely be a problem if they didn't cooperate. But they do. There's a lot of formal cooperation between all the provincial and territorial regulatory bodies. It's driven by recognizing that professionals need to be mobile across Canada, but without compromising public protection in any jurisdiction. So they've established agreements, principles of reciprocal licensing. Basically, if you're licensed in good standing in one province, having met what's generally understood as the national standard for competence, registering in another province is usually quite streamlined. Not automatic, but efficient.
Okay. So even though there isn't one single federal license, the underlying standards for education, for experience, for ethics via the NPPE are harmonized enough that the different bodies can generally recognize each other's credentials.
Exactly. They speak largely the same language when it comes to core competency. So, for example, someone applying to become a PGO typically applies where they live or where they intend to practice first. They go through the process with one of the 10 regulatory bodies. But the benchmarks they have to meet the academic requirements, the experience assessment, passing the NPPE, those are pretty consistent across the country. This cooperation ensures that the public, no matter which province they're in, can expect a comparable level of competence and ethical practice from a licensed professional.
Which leads us perfectly to the final and maybe most important point for our listeners today, the big so what? Especially for you, listening right now, maybe studying for the NPPE. Why do you need to truly understand and internalize this whole framework? It's not just about passing one exam, is it?
Absolutely not. This framework defines your entire professional identity and responsibilities. First off, understand that by seeking licensure, you're choosing to enter a regulated profession. That means you are legally binding yourself to follow the rules, the statutes, the bylaws, the codes of ethics. It's not optional. It's a condition of practice. You're signing up for a life of mandatory compliance.
And that compliance isn't just bureaucratic hoop jumping. It has a very specific higher purpose.
Precisely. The single most important purpose driving this entire legal structure, every rule, every standard, is public protection. As a licensed professional, your ultimate duty, your primary loyalty is to the public interest. That means safeguarding life, health, property, economic interests, the environment. And this is critical. That duty comes before the interests of your client, your employer, or even your own personal or financial interests. Understanding that hierarchy of obligations is the absolute core of professionalism. You have to get that. And finally, understanding this framework answers that fundamental legal question we started with. You must be licensed before you can legally take responsibility for engineering or geoscience work, sign off on it, use those protected titles. Your professional signature carries the full weight and authority of the law, and that authority only exists because of this whole licensing and self-regulation structure we've been talking about.
Okay, so let's try to wrap this up. Licensing and self-regulation.
They're the non-negotiable legal pillars for engineers and geoscientists in Canada. They work together to ensure professionals are competent and ethical. The system gives the profession significant authority, but in return imposes this profound, legally backed responsibility to protect the public above all else.
That's the essence of it. Competence, ethics, accountability, all mandated by law, all centered on public trust.
Right, and that trust is the foundation. The whole idea of delegating self-regulation rests on the public, believing that professionals truly know best how to protect them and are committed to doing so.
So here's a final thought, something for you to maybe chew on. As the world gets more complex, technology advances, knowledge becomes more specialized, should we be looking at more external government checks on these self-regulating professions to ensure that public trust is maintained? Or conversely, should the professions themselves be doing even more internally, strengthening their own accountability systems to prove they deserve that continued trust? Where does the balance lie in the future? Something to think about. And remember, if you are on that path to becoming a licensed professional, if you're gearing up for the NPPE and want more deep dives like this one,